Today, heroin is a word that closes conversations. It doesn't invite nuance or debate. It carries a fixed meaning: addiction, collapse, social ruin. Entire cities still bear its scars. That makes it difficult to imagine that heroin was once considered a medical breakthrough. Respected, prescribed, and trusted. It was sold legally, marketed professionally, and recommended by doctors. Not hidden in shadows, but discussed openly in medical journals. This is not a story about criminals or villains. It's a story about what happens when confidence outgrows doubt. To understand how heroin entered the world this way, we have to start with a company, and with two men whose names would eventually fade from the story. In 1863, in Wuppertal, Germany, Friedrich Bayer and Johann Friedrich Westcott founded a chemical business. It wasn't pharmaceutical, and it wasn't revolutionary. They manufactured synthetic dyes, aiming to build a modern, efficient industrial company. And they succeeded. Bayer grew quickly alongside the rise of industrial chemistry, expanding its factories, multiplying its laboratories, and formalizing its processes. By the end of the 19th century, Bayer was no longer guided by founders. It had become an institution. That transition matters more than it might seem. The founders didn't disappear through scandal or failure. They were simply overtaken by scale. Decision-making shifted away from individual judgment and into systems, committees, research departments, patents, and procedures. No single mind held responsibility. By the time heroin entered the picture, there was no founder left to argue with. Only authority remained. The world Bayer now operated in was changing rapidly. For most of human history, medicine had been cautious by necessity. Doctors relied on plants, tinctures, and tradition. But chemistry changed the rules. For the first time, humans could isolate molecules, modify them, and improve upon nature itself. This created a new belief, subtle but powerful, that if a substance could be seen, measured, and engineered, then it was understood. This was the age of chemical optimism, and Bayer became one of its most respected symbols. One of the great medical challenges of that era was pain, specifically morphine. Morphine was miraculous. It dulled agony like nothing else, making surgery and trauma survivable in ways previously unimaginable. But by the late 1800s, doctors began noticing a troubling pattern. Patients didn't just rely on morphine, they depended on it. Withdrawal was brutal, addiction widespread. Still, no one wanted to abandon morphine entirely. It worked too well. The question became whether science could improve it, whether chemistry could preserve its benefits while eliminating its dangers. Inside Bayer's laboratories, chemists attempted exactly that. In 1897, they made a small modification to the morphine molecule, adding 2 acetyl groups. The result was diacetylmorphine. Early observations were promising. It acted faster, felt smoother, and appeared to cause fewer cravings. With the limited tools and understanding of the time, it looked like progress. Bayer named the compound heroin, derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic. This wasn't cynical branding, it was an expression of scientific pride. Here is the critical point. No single person made this decision. Heroin didn't pass through a founder's conscience or a moral reckoning. It passed through institutional approval. Lab reports validated medical endorsements, which reinforced regulatory acceptance. Each step confirmed the next. This is how certainty is produced inside large systems, not through malice, but through repetition and authority. Heroin was introduced not as a risk, but as a solution. It was marketed as a safer alternative to morphine, a modern drug for a modern age. Bayer promoted it directly to physicians who prescribed it confidently. It was recommended for pain, anxiety, and respiratory illness, even for children suffering from severe coughs. Not because Bayer was reckless, but because within the system there was no alarm. Everything appeared to be working. Doctors trusted heroin because it was scientific. Governments trusted it because it was regulated. Patients trusted it because doctors did. And unlike Coca-Cola, which could quietly retreat from cocaine once public sentiment shifted, Bayer was a pharmaceutical authority. Medicine moved slowly, publicly, and with institutional weight. Once heroin became embedded in medical practice, reversing course was difficult. The system resisted correction. Within a few years, reality intruded. Doctors began noticing patterns they could no longer ignore. Patients weren't stabilizing, they were escalating. Heroin wasn't less addictive than morphine, it was more addictive. It reached the brain faster, delivered more intense relief, and produced a sharper crash. The improvement had been an illusion, but by then the drug was patented, distributed, and normalized. The machine was already in motion. Bayer eventually withdrew heroin from its catalog, and by the early 20th century, restrictions tightened and bans followed. But heroin didn't disappear. It escaped the clinic, moved into illicit markets, and became a global social catastrophe. Bayer's name would forever be associated with one of the most destructive substances in modern history, not because the company intended harm, but because it trusted its own certainty too much. This is where the story is often oversimplified. How could they not know? But that question assumes modern understanding. At the time, addiction science barely existed. Long-term studies were rare. The brain was largely a mystery. Refined chemistry was assumed to mean refined outcomes. Progress felt linear. This wasn't individual arrogance, it was systemic confidence. The real lesson of heroin isn't that science failed. Science always fails. The danger arises when failure is delayed because authority suppresses doubt. When no single person feels responsible enough to stop the process, and everyone involved is acting professionally, reasonably, and incorrectly. Bayer's founders didn't approve heroin. They weren't there to stop it either. By the time heroin entered the world, the founder had already vanished, replaced by something more powerful, an institution that produces certainty. And institutions don't feel hesitation. That is why the heroin story still matters, not because it is unique, but because it is familiar. A breakthrough arrives, validated by experts, scaled faster than understanding. Consequences arrive later, always later. We like to believe we have learned this lesson, yet modern pharmaceutical trust still rests on the same structure: expertise, authority, and scale. Most of the time, that trust is justified. But the heroin story reminds us that the greatest danger is not bad science. It is unquestioned science. Heroin was born from optimism, from the belief that chemistry could perfect nature, that refinement meant safety, that progress only moves forward. Those beliefs weren't foolish, they were incomplete. And incompleteness, amplified by power, becomes harm. Bayer still exists, medicine still advances, and society still places enormous faith in institutions that speak with scientific confidence. That faith isn't wrong, but it becomes dangerous when it goes unquestioned. Because when founders disappear, systems remain. And systems don't doubt themselves unless something forces them to. Next time, we're not looking at chemistry or medicine, but at something even more familiar. A company that didn't sell drugs or chemicals, but certainty itself. A system so trusted, so dominant, that it confused inevitability with permanence. Viewer AxeKillSlayer_TK requested it, and we made a pledge. AOL is coming. Because sometimes collapse isn't caused by failure. It's caused by believing the system is the world. Now I want to hear from you. Which founder, company, or rise and fall story should we cover next? Drop your ideas in the comments, and it might just become the next episode of The Founder Files.